step inside a Kansas saloon in 1873 and never look at the Wild West the same way. The glass had been sitting there for 2 hours, full, untouched, sweating in the August heat while everything around it moved. Cards sliding across felt, boots scraping against floorboards, the low, constant roar of 80 men packed into a room built for 40. The man behind the glass hadn't moved either. Cad Pierce sat with both hands flat on the table, his hat pushed back just far enough to show his eyes, and his eyes hadn't left the same spot since he sat down. 3 feet away, Happy Jack Morco watched him back. The bartender had noticed 12 minutes ago he'd stopped wiping the counter and hadn't started again. This was a Tuesday night in Ellsworth, Kansas, August 15, 1873. And the Drovers Cottage Saloon was doing what it did every night of cattle season. It was holding an entire world inside 4 wooden walls, a world of exhausted men and warm whiskey and money-changing hands faster than anyone could track it. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of livestock that no amount of sawdust on the floor could fully absorb. A piano in the corner pushed out something that might have been a waltz. Nobody was dancing. Before we continue, yes, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comment where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always find it fascinating to see people from all over the world united by one story. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 84 degrees. Inside, it hadn't dropped at all. Pierce had ridden into Ellsworth 4 days earlier at the end of a cattle drive that had started in southern Texas in late April. 3.5 months on the trail, nearly 800 miles. He'd arrived expecting to be paid, expecting the market prices that had been quoted when the drive began, expecting that the summer of work would translate into something solid he could hold. What he found instead was a number so much smaller than the one he'd been carrying in his head for 3 months that he'd had to ask twice to make sure he understood. He understood. The market had collapsed. His cut of the drive's earnings was enough to last him if he was careful. About 2 weeks he was not being careful. Happy Jack Morco was a deputy sheriff. This is a fact worth holding on to because it means that what was building between these 2 men in the corner of the Drovers Cottage was not simply a personal grievance, it was something the law was already inside of. Morco had a badge and a gun and a history in Ellsworth that the drovers who blew through in summer didn't have, and that gap in permanence was its own kind of power. He had been watching Pierce since Pierce sat down, not casually. The way a man watches something he has already made a decision about and is simply waiting for the right geometry of the room. The bartender's name was John. He had a last name, but no one used it. He was the one who had poured Pierce's drink and watched it sit there untouched, and somewhere in the 2 hours since, he had started to understand what the untouched drink meant. Not boredom, not distraction, something else entirely, something that had a grammar in this room, in this town, in this specific summer of broken, furious men that he had learned to read the way a doctor learns to read a pulse. Fast was one thing. Stopped was another. And Pierce's glass had stopped. 43 other men were in the room, and most of them knew it too. That is the thing that histories of the frontier tend to miss. The collective awareness of a saloon in the seconds before something happens. It was not chaos, it was not oblivious noise. It was a room full of people who had learned, out of pure survival necessity, to read the temperature of a crowd the way sailors read clouds. The man nearest the door had shifted his weight toward it 20 minutes ago and hadn't shifted back. 2 card players at the middle table had been holding the same hands for longer than any real game required. The piano had gotten quieter, though the player hadn't stopped. Nobody left. That is the part that seems wrong from a distance. Nobody left because leaving was its own kind of statement in this room, and the statement it made was that you knew something was coming and you were afraid of it. In Ellsworth in 1873, showing fear was a calculation with costs. So they stayed. 80 men in a room that smelled like animals and alcohol and summer heat, and every one of them performing indifference with the focused intensity of men who were paying very close attention. Then the door opened. Not Morco, not Pierce. Someone else. A drover named Billy Thompson, who had been drinking since noon at a different establishment and had arrived here with the specific looseness of a man who had passed the point where his body was giving him accurate information about itself. He moved through the room without reading it, the way a person walks into a tense conversation mid-sentence and doesn't realize for a full beat that the talking has already stopped. He pulled out a chair at a table near the bar. The chair scraped the floor. In the silence that had been accumulating under the piano noise, that scrape was like a seam ripping. Pierce's hands moved off the table. What happened in the next 4 minutes inside the Drovers Cottage on August 15th, 1873, would cost one man his life, one man his badge, and would set in motion a chain of decisions that would change Ellsworth permanently, and would eventually reach all the way to a young lawman working a different Kansas town, a man whose name would later become synonymous with a version of the West that was mostly invented. But the real story, the one that actually happened, was stranger and more human than any of the legends that came after it. By sunrise, the Drovers Cottage would be quieter than it had been all season. 3 men would be gone who had been there at 10 o'clock. The bartender would still be behind the bar. He was almost always still there, but he would be doing something that no one would write down for another 40 years. Something small and deliberate, something that in its own way explained more about how the frontier actually survived itself than any gunfight ever did. To understand any of it, you have to understand what Kansas was in 1873. Not the Kansas of legend, not the Kansas of dime novels and campfire stories, the real one, flat and enormous and violent in ways that had nothing to do with guns, full of people who had arrived from somewhere else and were trying to build something functional out of almost nothing in a place that seemed, some seasons, to be actively working against them. The saloon was not the problem. The saloon was the solution. And that distinction between what the frontier saloon actually was and what it became in the American imagination is where this story really begins. Kansas in 1873 was not a place that eased you in. The land arrived all at once, flat in every direction, grass running to the horizon without a single thing to stop your eye, the sky so large and unbroken that people who had grown up in forests or cities reported a specific physical discomfort when they first saw it, a sensation that took weeks to stop feeling like a threat. The wind never fully stopped, not in summer, not in winter, not at any point in between. It was a constant presence, like a sound you eventually stopped hearing, but that was reshaping you anyway. The winters hit -20. The summers pushed past 110. In between those two extremes, there were the storms, tornadoes that could drop out of a yellow sky in under 4 minutes, hailstorms that killed cattle where they stood, flash floods that turned dry creek beds into walls of brown water, moving faster than a horse could run. The land was fertile, which was why people came, and the land was brutal, which was why so many of them didn't stay. By 1873, Kansas had been a state for only 12 years. It had arrived at statehood through a political crisis so violent that the territory had been nicknamed Bleeding Kansas throughout the 1850s, a decade of guerrilla warfare between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers that served as a preview of the Civil War before the Civil War officially began. The men and women who stayed through all of that were not soft. The ones who arrived afterward, drawn by land grants and railroad promotions and the specific American belief that somewhere out west there was a place where everything could be different. They were not soft either, or they didn't stay long enough to matter. The railroad changed everything, the way it changed everything, everywhere it arrived. The Kansas Pacific Railway pushed west through the 1860s, and wherever it stopped, a town materialized around the depot with startling speed. Abilene, Salina, Ellsworth, Wichita. These were not towns that grew organically over generations. They were installed, a depot, a water tower, a livestock pen, and then within weeks the infrastructure of human need, hotels, supply stores, lawyers, doctors, and saloons, always and always first. In 1867, Abilene had one permanent building. By 1870, it had 11 saloons. The cattle trade was the engine driving all of it. After the Civil War, Texas was full of longhorn cattle that had been breeding wild and unattended for 4 years, while the men who owned them were fighting. By 1866, there were an estimated 5 million longhorns in Texas, and they were worth approximately $4 a head locally. But in the northern markets, the same animal was worth 40. The math required only a trail. The Chisholm Trail ran roughly 700 miles from southern Texas to the Kansas railheads. Driving cattle along it was not a romantic occupation. It was 3 to 4 months of sleeping on the ground in all weather, eating the same 4 things in rotation, riding 15 to 20 miles a day in dust so thick that the men in the rear of the drive wore bandanas over their faces from sunup to sundown. Stampeders, sudden panicked runs by the herd, triggered by lightning or a rattlesnake or sometimes nothing visible at all, could happen at any hour of the night, requiring every man to ride into darkness at full speed toward the sound of 10,000 hooves. Men were trampled, men drowned at river crossings. Men were struck by lightning on flat ground with nowhere to shelter. A typical crew driving 2,000 cattle consisted of about 12 men. They were paid at the end, not during, which meant that everything they needed for 4 months, food, equipment, medical care, was advanced against wages they hadn't earned yet, kept in a ledger by the trail boss. By the time they reached Kansas, some drovers owed more than their cut would cover. Others arrived with enough to feel, briefly, like wealthy men. The difference between those two outcomes was often nothing more than whether the cattle market had moved in the weeks since the drive began. In 1873 it had moved sharply downward. The Panic of 1873 is a chapter of American history that most people have never heard of, which is strange given its scale. In September of that year, the banking house of J. Cook and Company, with the largest in the United States, the institution that had financed the Union war effort, collapsed overnight. Stock markets closed. Banks stopped lending. The ripple moved outward with the speed that financial panics always move, which is faster than news, faster than understanding. Within weeks, the effects had reached Kansas. The drovers who arrived in Ellsworth that August were arriving just ahead of the wave. Some of them had heard rumors, a few had seen newspapers. Most had been on the trail since April, with no reliable information about anything that had happened in the outside world, riding into a market that no longer existed in the form they'd been promised. The cattle prices had dropped by more than half in some categories. A drive that should have earned $40,000 might earn 18. The drovers' individual cuts shrank accordingly, and the bills they'd been running up against those future wages did not shrink with them. This is the pressure that filled the saloons of Ellsworth in the summer of 1873. Now, here is the thing that changes the picture entirely. The saloon, this place that the history books treat as a backdrop for violence, a moral failing, a symptom of frontier lawlessness, was in most Kansas cattle towns the single most important civic institution in existence. Not the most important drinking establishment, the most important building, full stop, because in a town that had been standing for 3 years, there was often no courthouse, no permanent church, no hospital, no bank vault, no post office with regular hours. The saloon had all of those things, or it substituted for all of those things with a flexibility that no formal institution could match. Legal disputes were settled at the bar, not metaphorically. A saloon keeper's testimony in a frontier legal proceeding carried weight that a distant judge's written opinion sometimes didn't, simply because the saloon keeper had been present and the judge had not. Land deals were negotiated over tables that still had card marks on them. Loans were made and recorded in ledgers kept behind the bar alongside the bottles. A man who needed a letter written, and many men did because literacy on the frontier was not universal, went to the bartender, who was often the only person within 20 miles who could help him. The safe behind the bar was frequently the most secure place in town to store valuables. There was no competing institution. The church, if one existed at all in a cattle town during the active season, was typically a tent structure that blew down in the first serious storm and wasn't replaced until winter. The doctor, if the town had one, worked out of a room in a hotel and was gone for weeks at a time on house calls spread across hundreds of square miles of prairie. The marshal's office was often a single room attached to a single jail cell staffed by whoever the town could afford that week. The saloon was open every day, all day. The building itself was a specific object, not an abstraction. In Ellsworth in 1873, a substantial saloon like the Drovers Cottage was a frame structure. Wood shipped in by rail because there were no trees on the Kansas prairie large enough to build with. The facade was taller than the building behind it, a flat, false front that made the structure look larger from the street, designed to signal permanence in a place that had very little of it. Inside, a bar running the length of one wall, a mirror behind it that was almost certainly the largest piece of glass within 50 miles, shelves of bottles, a cash drawer, and whatever the owner had managed to acquire in the way of chairs and tables. The mirror was not decorative. A bartender, watching a room full of armed, exhausted, financially ruined men, needed to see everything behind him without turning his back. The mirror was a survival tool. So was the shotgun kept below the bar, and the second man stationed near the door, whose only visible function was to stand there, and whose actual function everyone understood without it being stated. Kansas had more saloons per capita in the 1870s than any modern American city has coffee shops. In Ellsworth alone, during the peak cattle season of 1872, there were approximately 32 licensed saloons serving a permanent population of fewer than 1,000 people, a population that swelled to 5,000 or 6,000 during the summer months as drovers arrived and buyers came up from the railheads, and the gamblers and the merchants and the women who worked the dance halls all moved to wherever the money was moving. For 90 days every year, these cattle towns were among the densest concentrations of cash, weapons, alcohol, and unregulated human behavior anywhere in North America. For the other 9 months, they were nearly empty. That rhythm, explosion, then silence, flood, then drought, shaped everything about how these places worked, including the saloon. It could not operate the way a permanent establishment operated because it was not permanent in any meaningful sense. It had to extract a year's worth of revenue from a season that lasted less than 100 days. That pressure shaped the prices, the games, the entertainment, the tolerance for behavior that would have been unacceptable elsewhere. Everything was compressed, intensified, stripped of the patience that long-term relationships allow. And everyone inside it knew, on some level, that it would end. The drovers knew they were leaving. The gamblers knew they'd follow the money south when the season closed. Even the people who called Ellsworth home knew that the cattle trade was not guaranteed, that the railroad could extend further, that the Texas ranchers could find a different route, that the whole apparatus depended on market conditions that changed in New York and Philadelphia in rooms where no one on the Kansas prairie had any voice at all. The saloon was the center of a world that everyone inside it knew was temporary. That knowledge on despair exactly, but a specific awareness of impermanence, was in the air of every saloon in every cattle town every night of every season. It was in the way men spent money they couldn't afford to spend, in the way fights started over insults that would have been ignored in a stable community, in the way the piano kept playing even when the room had gone quiet, in the particular way it went quiet when something was about to happen. In Ellsworth, that particular quiet had arrived on Tuesday, August 15th. The glass on the table in front of Cad Pierce was still full. The details of why it was still full, and what it would cost to leave it that way, depended entirely on who was inside that room and who those people actually were. The first thing to understand about the people inside a Kansas cattle town saloon in 1873 is that almost none of them were supposed to be there. Not in the sense of permission, in the sense of origin. They had come from somewhere else, every single one of them, pulled by different forces toward the same unlikely patch of treeless prairie, and the distance between where they had started and where they now stood was not just geographical, it was a rupture, a before and after. The man drinking at the bar had a mother somewhere who didn't know where he was. The woman dealing cards in the back room had a name that nobody here used. The farmer nursing a single beer at the far table had crossed an ocean before he crossed Kansas, and the language he dreamed in was not English. The saloon held all of them at once, without asking questions. Start with the drover. Not Cad Pierce specifically. The type of man he represented, because there were thousands of them moving through Kansas every season, and their stories followed a pattern close enough to be almost one story. He was young. The average age of a trail hand on the Chisholm drives was 24, and many were younger, 16, 17, boys who had grown up in the wreckage of post-Civil War Texas and found that the cattle trade was one of the few economies available to them. He had calluses on his hands so thick that a knife blade could press against his palm without drawing blood. His boots had been resoled at least twice. Everything he owned fit in a single saddlebag, and one of the items in that saddlebag was a folded piece of paper he hadn't been able to bring himself to throw away. A letter from his mother, written 18 months ago, which he had never answered because he didn't know how to write. He wasn't unusual in that. Roughly 40% of trail hands in this period were functionally illiterate. What he could do was ride. He could read weather by the feel of the air before it changed. He could judge the mood of a herd of 2,000 animals the way a conductor reads an orchestra, by subtle shifts in collective behavior, small sounds, the direction of 1,000 sets of ears. He had crossed the Red River at flood stage twice and hadn't drowned either time. He had stayed awake for 36 consecutive hours during a series of stampedes in Indian Territory and had not made a single decision in that time that got anyone killed. He arrived in Ellsworth with $9.11. Now consider what he was not. He was not, in the majority of cases, white. This is a fact that the mythology of the American West erased so thoroughly that it takes deliberate effort to restore it. Approximately 1 in 3 cowboys on the Chisholm Trail was black or Mexican, some of them former enslaved men who had found in the cattle trade a form of economic participation that the post-war South refused to offer them, some of them Mexican vaqueros whose families had been working cattle in Texas before Texas was American territory. They rode the same trail, slept on the same ground, and ate from the same pot. They were paid the same wages, or nearly. They were not received the same way when they arrived in Kansas. The saloon had its own geography of race that shifted depending on the establishment, the owner, the season, and the specific composition of whoever was inside on a given night. Some places served everyone at the same bar. Others had informal arrangements, a section, a separate entrance, a different set of prices for the same drink. The rules were never written down, which meant they were always subject to renegotiation, which meant they were always a potential source of exactly the kind of friction that a room full of armed men didn't need. The drover navigated all of this without a map because there wasn't one. Now, moved to the other side of the bar. The bartender, in a frontier saloon, was not who most people picture when they imagine the role. He was not a young man in an apron improvising behind a plank of wood. The bartender in an established cattle town saloon was typically in his 30s or 40s, often a veteran of the Civil War, and frequently the most educated person in any room he occupied. Saloon keeping required literacy for the ledgers, numeracy for the accounting, enough legal knowledge to handle disputes, enough medical knowledge to handle injuries, and enough social intelligence to manage a crowd of armed men in various states of intoxication without triggering a catastrophe on any given night. These were not common skills on the frontier. They commanded real compensation. A head bartender in a busy Ellsworth establishment during cattle season could earn as much as $150 a month, at a time when a trail hand earned $30, a schoolteacher earned $40, and a deputy sheriff earned $60. The bartender earned more than the lawman. He also, in most cases, knew more about what was actually happening in the town than the lawman did, because people told him things they didn't tell anyone with a badge. Not because they trusted him more necessarily, because he was there every night, and the rhythm of his presence had made him part of the furniture in a way that made men forget to be careful about what they said in front of him. Behind the bar at the Drovers Cottage in August 1873, there was a shelf of books, not for show. The bartender read them in the hours between 3 and 6 in the morning, when the establishment was empty and the town outside was as quiet as it ever got. He had 3 volumes of legal reference, a medical text published in 1869, 2 novels he'd read enough times to have memorized large sections, and a Bible he used not for the text, but for the thin blank pages at the front and back, which he filled with notes in a handwriting so small that you needed good light to read it. Those notes were a record of debts, disputes, and dealings going back 4 years. Nobody else knew the notes existed. That small fact would matter before the night of August 15th was over. Now, the gambler. He was not passing through. This is what distinguished the professional gambler from every other type of person in the saloon. The drover was temporary, The homesteader farmer was local, the bartender was essential but salaried. The gambler lived there in the most literal sense. He had a room in the back, or upstairs, or in the hotel next door that he had negotiated a rate for on a monthly basis. He ate his meals at the back table. He knew the names of the horses tied out front because he'd been watching them come and go for months. He knew which men tipped and which men didn't, which men got mean after the third drink and which men got generous, which men were carrying more money than their clothes suggested, and which men were carrying less. He knew the tell of every regular player in Ellsworth before they'd finished their first hand. His own tell, if he had one, he'd spent years removing. The gambler in this world was not, as the dime novels like to portray, a figure of exotic elegance in a velvet coat. He was a working professional with specific technical skills, the mathematics of probability, the psychology of reading deception, the physical discipline of controlling his own face and hands under pressure, who had made a rational economic calculation that his skills were worth more in a frontier saloon than in any other available labor market. He was usually right. A skilled gambler in a busy cattle season saloon could clear $200 in a week. He could also be dead in 30 seconds if he was caught cheating. This was not an abstract risk. It was a number he had done the math on carefully early in his career and had then built an entire professional practice around avoiding. He did not cheat. This was not a moral position. It was a business decision rooted in the fact that the men he played against were armed, and the room he played in was far from any courthouse that could complicate the consequences of shooting a card cheat. Honest gambling, which is to say, gambling that relied on actual superior skill rather than manipulation, was both safer and, for a genuinely talented player, more profitable long-term. He watched Cad Pierce's table from the far end of the room. He had been watching for 40 minutes by the time Billy Thompson came through the door, and what he had concluded from watching was the same thing the bartender had concluded, and the same thing the man near the exit had concluded, that the untouched glass was not a small thing. It was the largest thing in the room. Finally, the man at the end of the bar. His name was Wilhelm Schaefer, though the men around him had shortened it to Will, and before that to a nickname that had stuck for reasons nobody could quite reconstruct anymore. He had come from Bavaria in 1866, one of tens of thousands of German immigrants who had taken the government's land grants in Kansas and built homesteads on the prairie. He spoke English well enough, with an accent that some of the Texans mocked and others didn't notice. His farm was 6 miles east of Ellsworth, 320 acres of winter wheat that had done badly this year because the spring had been too dry and then too wet. He came to the Drovers Cottage on Tuesday evenings. 1 beer, sometimes 2. He didn't gamble. He sat at the end of the bar where he had a clear view of the room and the door, and he watched. Not with suspicion, with the calm, broad attention of a man who had grown up in a village small enough that watching who came in and out of the inn was simply how you understood the world. He had been doing this every Tuesday since he arrived in Ellsworth in 1869. He had watched 4 years of Tuesday nights in this room, which meant he had seen things accumulate and resolve in ways that a man passing through could never perceive. He had seen a Tuesday exactly like this one. Twice. He knew how both of those nights had ended. He was the only person in the room who had that specific, terrible knowledge, the institutional memory of a building that kept no records of what it had witnessed. He set his beer down on the bar with a care that looked like ordinary caution. His eyes moved from Pierce to Morco and back to Pierce with a steadiness that had nothing casual in it. He didn't reach for his beer again. None of them? Pierce Morco, the gambler, tracking the room from the far table, Wilhelm Schaefer with his untouched beer. None of them knew, walking through that door on a Tuesday night in August, how far the consequences of the next 2 hours would travel. The drover who was already dead in Texas thought he knew the range of what a cattle season could cost him. The deputy, with his hand resting near his hip, thought he understood exactly how the night was positioned. The bartender, with his hidden ledger, thought he had enough information to manage whatever came. They were all about to discover the specific distance between what they knew and what was true. The cattle season of 1873 had been wrong from the beginning, not wrong in any single dramatic way, wrong in the accumulating manner of a structure that has too many small failures in too many load-bearing places at once. The spring drives out of Texas had started later than usual because of flooding along the lower Red River. The herds arrived in Kansas compressed into a shorter window, which meant more cattle on the market simultaneously, which meant prices that had already been softening began to drop faster. The ranchers who had planned their finances around $40 a head were revising their numbers downward in April. By June, they were revising them again. By August, when the largest portion of the season's drives was arriving in Ellsworth, the number on the board at the livestock pens was something that experienced men looked at and then looked away from, as if it might change if they gave it a moment. It didn't change. The specific figure for a Texas longhorn in Ellsworth in August 1873 was somewhere between $16 and $22 depending on weight, condition, and the buyer, compared to the $35 to $40 that had been the working assumption when most of these drives departed in late April. The math of that gap was not complicated, and the men doing it in their heads as they rode into town were not slow. They had spent 4 months on the trail for a number that was roughly half of what they had been promised by implication when they signed on, and they had already spent money they hadn't earned yet. The advanced system that governed trail drive compensation was a mechanism designed for a stable market, which is to say, it was a mechanism designed for conditions that did not exist in 1873. A drover would typically receive a cash advance before departure to cover personal equipment: boots, a bedroll, a decent knife, ammunition. Additional charges accumulated throughout the drive: replacement gear, medical expenses if the trail boss fronted them, and in some cases gambling debts run up at stops along the way and recorded in the ledger that followed a man to settlement. By the time a drover reached Kansas, the amount owed against his wages could represent weeks of work. Some men arrived in Ellsworth already in debt before they were paid. This was not exceptional. It was the structural condition of the labor market these men inhabited, and the saloon owners and merchants and gamblers of Ellsworth understood it precisely because they had built their pricing around it. A man who knew he was owed money but hadn't received it yet spent differently than a man spending from savings. He spent faster, with less caution, on the specific logic that it was money he was owed and therefore money he already had. The saloons understood this psychology. The drink prices reflected it. Ellsworth in the summer of 1873 was a machine for converting trail wages into someone else's profit, and the machine was running at full speed into a market that had already stopped. Then in the second week of August the newspapers arrived. The Kansas papers got their financial news from the Eastern Wire Services, which got it from Philadelphia and New York. And what was coming down the wire in August of 1873 was the early signal of what would become the panic. Not the full collapse yet, but the tremors. The banking firms were contracting, credit was tightening. J. Cook and Company, the institution that had financed the Transcontinental Railroad and the Union war effort, and the westward expansion that had put every man in this room, in Kansas in the first place, was rumored to be in serious trouble. The newspapers carrying that information arrived in Ellsworth on August 12th, 3 days before the Tuesday night at the Drovers Cottage, which means that some of the men in the room that night had read the news, or had it read to them, or had heard it discussed at another table, and some had not. That asymmetry of information in a room full of men who were already financially exposed and emotionally compressed from months on the trail was its own kind of fuel. The men who knew looked at the men who didn't know and made calculations. The men who didn't know felt something had shifted in the room without understanding what. That sensation of a change whose cause you can't identify is one of the most reliable precursors to violence in an enclosed space. But the financial pressure was only the surface layer. Underneath it was something that had been building since the first drives arrived in Ellsworth in late spring, something that had nothing to do with cattle prices and everything to do with what happened when a specific combination of people occupied the same small geography for 90 consecutive days. The permanent residents of Ellsworth were, in the main, Kansas settlers, farmers, merchants, tradespeople, and their families, many of them Midwesterners or European immigrants who had chosen this place with the intention of building something lasting. They wanted schools, churches, orderly streets, and the gradual accumulation of a community with shared norms. They had voted for incorporation. They had elected a mayor. They were, by the standards of 1873, attempting civilization. Into this every summer arrived 15,000 strangers. The Drovers were not building anything in Ellsworth. They were passing through it. Their relationship to the town's future was zero. They would be gone in a week, and the consequences of anything they did here would be inherited by people they'd never meet. This is not a criticism. It is a structural condition, and it produced structural outcomes. Men with no stake in a place's future make different decisions in it than men who will have to live with the results. The weapons made everything worse. Specifically, their presence. Kansas had attempted to address this with municipal ordinances. Ellsworth's town council had passed regulations requiring drovers to surrender their firearms upon entering the city limits, a rule that was posted on a sign at the edge of town and enforced with the consistency that any rule is enforced when the people enforcing it are outnumbered 20-1 by the people it applies to. Some men complied. They handed their guns to the marshal's office, received a token, reclaimed their weapons on departure. This system worked well enough when the marshal was present, organized, and not dealing with 3 other situations simultaneously. It did not work well enough on most nights of cattle season. In the summer of 1873, Ellsworth's marshal was Chauncey Whitney, and Whitney had a problem that no municipal ordinance could solve: his own deputy. Happy Jack Morco had a reputation in Ellsworth that had been building since his arrival, a reputation assembled from specific incidents that the town's permanent residents discussed with the careful language of people who were afraid of the subject. He had beaten a Mexican drover badly enough to require medical attention over a debt that may or may not have been real. He had discharged his weapon inside the city limits twice and been officially reprimanded once. He had a manner in the saloons that experienced observers described, in the documents that survived, as looking for it. He had been looking for it for months by the time Cad Pierce sat down at that table. Pierce was not an innocent party in whatever was building between them. The documents are thin on the specifics of their prior history. Frontier disputes left paperwork only when they ended in courts, and most of them didn't. But the general shape is visible. There had been an earlier confrontation, probably over money or status, or the complex social precedents of men who both carried guns and needed, for reasons of survival, to establish who would step back first in a given situation. Neither had stepped back. The confrontation had resolved without resolution, which is to say, it had paused and been waiting ever since. By August 15th, it had been waiting long enough. Consider the specific arithmetic of what was in that saloon at 10 o'clock that night. 80 men in a room of roughly 800 square feet, a space slightly larger than a two-car garage, jammed with tables and chairs and a bar, and a piano, and 80 individual bodies radiating heat into a Kansas August that had already reached 104 degrees at midday. At least 60 of those 80 men were armed with at least one firearm. Many were armed with two. The average drover arriving at the end of a cattle season had consumed, by conservative historical estimate, more alcohol in the previous 72 hours than he would consume in a typical month back home, not because he was dissolute, but because the drive was over, the money was in hand or expected, and the social permission that had been suspended for 4 months had suddenly all at once lifted. Add the financial shock of the market collapse, add the newspaper news about Jay Cook, add the accumulated friction between Morco and Pierce, add Billy Thompson, who had been drinking since noon, and subtract the one thing that might have contained all of it. Chauncey Whitney, the town marshal, had left the Drovers Cottage at 9:30 that evening to respond to a report of a disturbance at another establishment 2 blocks east. He had taken his one available deputy with him, which was not Morco. Morco was already in the saloon, already watching Pierce, already occupying the room with the specific energy of a man who had decided something and was waiting for the moment to execute the decision. Whitney had been gone for 45 minutes. The room knew he was gone the way a room always knows when the one restraining presence has left it. Nobody announced it. Nobody needed to. The collective awareness shifted, and the space between Morco and Pierce, 3 feet of open air across a table, became a different kind of space. The men nearest them had been expanding that perimeter slowly and continuously for 20 minutes, moving their chairs by inches, occupying themselves with their drinks and cards, with the focused attention of people who were about to need to move quickly. The glass on the table in front of Pierce was still full. Whatever Morco was waiting for, he was almost there. And somewhere in the saloon, the person who understood this best was not a lawman or a gunfighter. He was the man behind the bar, watching the mirror, his hand resting on the counter 6 inches from the sawed-off shotgun mounted below the shelf line. He had 12 minutes, at most, to change the shape of what was coming. Whether 12 minutes was enough depended on something he couldn't know yet. Whether the men in this room were past the point where anything could be changed, or whether they were still, barely, in the territory where a single decision made by the right person at the right moment could pull the whole thing back from the edge. The piano player was still playing. Quieter now, much quieter. The Drovers Cottage opened at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Not because 4 was a meaningful hour in any civic sense, but because the cattle pens closed at 3:30, and the men who had spent the day negotiating livestock sales needed approximately 30 minutes to walk from the pens to the saloon and arrive thirsty. The timing was not accidental. Nothing about the operational structure of a successful frontier saloon was accidental. Every hour of the day had been engineered around the specific rhythms of the men whose money it was designed to receive. By 4:15, the bar had its first 20 customers. These were not the drovers. The drovers came later after they had cleaned up. a relative term meaning they had changed their shirts and run water over their faces at the pump behind the hotel. The 4:15 crowd was the permanent population, merchants closing their shops, the land agent who kept an office above the hardware store, 2 or 3 lawyers who practiced the kind of law that required constant proximity to wherever disputes were being generated. They drank bourbon mostly. They talked prices and weather and the condition of the roads east. They were gone by 6. What replaced them was a different civilization entirely. The drovers arrived in groups, rarely alone because the social habits of the trail, traveling in company, eating in company, sleeping in shifts with always someone awake, had restructured their relationship to solitude over 4 months until being alone felt like exposure rather than privacy. They came in through the main door and spread immediately, filling tables with the practiced efficiency of men who had learned to claim space quickly or go without it. The noise level doubled in under 10 minutes. The piano, which had been playing softly for the benefit of the bourbon drinkers, shifted to something faster. The bartender's first decision of every evening was what to put on the bar. This sounds simple. It was not simple. The whiskey served in a Kansas frontier saloon in 1873 bore essentially no relationship to the product the same word described in Kentucky distilleries. What arrived in Ellsworth by rail and was decanted into bottles labeled with names like Old Crow or Tao's Lightning was a mixture assembled locally from a base of raw grain alcohol, harsh, high proof, essentially industrial, combined with whatever the proprietor used to add color and taste. Burnt sugar gave it the amber appearance of aged whiskey. Tobacco added bitterness. Chili peppers provided heat that the drinker interpreted as the burn of strong spirits. Some establishments used red pepper. Some used a small amount of actual laudanum, which is opium dissolved in alcohol, which explained certain evenings in ways that straight whiskey couldn't fully account for. A man who drank 3 glasses of this substance was not in the same condition as a man who had drunk 3 glasses of bourbon. He was in a more dangerous condition because the effects were less predictable, and the variables in each batch were never quite the same. The bartender knew his own product well enough to track, by watching a man's second and third drink, roughly how the evening would develop for that man. The way the eyes changed between the second and third glass told him things about the next 2 hours that experience had taught him to read accurately. He watched this the way a ship's captain watches weather, not with certainty, but with enough knowledge to start making preparations before the problem fully arrived. What did those preparations look like practically? The most important tool was conversation, not warm conversation. Strategic conversation, used with the precision of a medical instrument. A man who was talking to the bartender was not escalating with the man next to him. A man who had been asked a question about his drive, his home county in Texas, the condition of the river crossings this season, was a man whose attention had been redirected into a narrative rather than a grievance. The bartender at the Drovers Cottage had a repertoire of these redirections that he had developed over 4 cattle seasons, and he deployed them the way a chess player uses positioning moves, not to win anything immediately, but to control the structure of what came next. He also controlled the pour. A short pour, a glass filled slightly less than a man expected, was a way of slowing down the consumption of a customer who was moving too fast toward the dangerous end of the evening's arc. Most men didn't notice. The ones who did notice and complained received an apology and a correction, and the bartender noted them as men to watch more carefully. The ones who didn't notice were the majority, and managing them was an act of invisible public safety that happened dozens of times every night, was never recorded, and saved a measurable amount of violence across a season. No one paid him extra for this, It was included in the position. The gambling operation was spatially separate from the bar, which was a deliberate architectural decision. The tables were at the back and along the left wall, which meant a man moving from the bar to the gambling tables had to cross most of the room. A transit that required navigating other bodies, other conversations, other potential friction points, a journey just long enough that a man who had been at the bar for 2 hours and was now considering sitting down to cards had time to arrive at the table, having passed through the social reality of the room rather than proceeding directly from alcohol to high-stakes decision-making. It didn't always work, but it worked more often than nothing. The games ran continuously. Faro was the most popular. A card game that had originated in France, arrived in America through New Orleans, and spread with the frontier because it was fast, required minimal equipment, and could accommodate a large number of players simultaneously. A faro bank could process 20 or 30 bets in under 2 minutes. At a table handling 50-cent minimum bets during a busy Tuesday evening in cattle season, the volume of money moving was extraordinary, not in any single transaction, but in aggregate, the same way a river moves more water than any individual current within it. A skilled faro dealer could handle 300 hands in an evening. Poker ran at the other tables, and poker was a different social organism. It was slower. It required reading people, managing a table dynamic that could turn on a single hand, maintaining a face over hours rather than minutes. The men who played poker seriously were fewer and more deliberate than the faro crowd, and the pots were larger, and the consequences of losses were more personal. A man who lost at faro lost money. A man who lost at poker lost to specific other men who were sitting 3 feet away from him, and that distinction, losing to a mechanism versus losing to a person, produced very different emotional outcomes. The gambler at the far table understood this distinction precisely. He played poker exclusively, and he chose his tables with the care of a surgeon choosing instruments, not the tables with the most money, but the tables with the right combination of players. Enough skill to make the game interesting. Not so much skill that the margin evaporated, men who were drunk enough to be loose with their decisions, but not so drunk that they'd become unpredictable in the unmanageable sense. He had a formula for this that he had never written down, because writing it down would have made it visible, and visibility was his primary professional risk. That evening, he had won $31 in the first 3 hours. He had also been tracking the situation at Pierce's table since approximately 8:30, which was when the quality of the room had changed in the way he had trained himself to detect, a thinning of the social ambient noise, conversations losing their easy circulation and becoming local, contained, too focused. His eyes moved from his own cards to that corner of the room and back in a rotation so practiced it had stopped being conscious. At 9:45 he cashed out. Quietly, without explanation. He moved to a chair against the back wall, ordered nothing, and watched. This was a man who had survived 4 years in Cattletown saloons, not through toughness or speed or any quality that could be measured in confrontation, but through the specific discipline of knowing when to stop being a participant and become an observer. The men who didn't know that distinction, who stayed in the game because leaving felt like retreat, were the men whose names showed up in the newspapers under the wrong kind of headline. He had no intention of being in a newspaper. Now consider what everyone in the room was eating, because this detail matters and histories consistently omit it. The Drovers Cottage served food, not as a separate restaurant function, as an extension of the bar operation, because a man who was eating was a man spending more time and money in the establishment, and because a man with food in his stomach metabolized the frontier whiskey at a different rate than a man without it. The menu was not elaborate. Salted beef, usually. Hard biscuits. Sometimes a bean stew that had been on the stove since the previous afternoon, and whose composition depended on what the cook had been able to source that week. There was no refrigeration. None. Everything served in a frontier saloon in August was either preserved in salt, preserved in alcohol, or cooked that day and served before it became something that would make a man sick. The salt was heavy because salt was doing the work that cold couldn't. A drover arriving after months on the trail, eating from a chuck wagon that had the same supply limitations, did not notice the salt. His palate had been recalibrated by necessity into something that accepted conditions that a modern person would find inedible. He ate the beef, he drank the whiskey, he sat in the heat. The heat deserves its own accounting. August in Kansas, inside a building, with no ventilation beyond the doors and what windows existed, packed with 80 bodies, and 2 oil lamps per table, and a stove in the back that was never fully off, because the cooking required it. The temperature inside the Drovers Cottage at 10 o'clock on August 15th was somewhere between 95 and 100 degrees. Men sweated through their shirts within an hour of arriving. The smell of the room was a specific compound of animal, tobacco, alcohol, wood smoke, sweat, and the particular sourness of men who had been working outdoors for months, and whose access to bathing was a luxury rather than a routine. Nobody remarked on it. There was no alternative. The piano player had been at his instrument since 5 o'clock that evening, which meant that by 10 he had been playing for 5 hours without a break, longer than the time it took to accept a drink that someone had sent over. His name appears in no record connected to this night or any other. What is documented is that the Drovers Cottage employed a piano player throughout the 1873 season who had lost the use of his right index finger to a farming accident 3 years earlier and had adapted his playing to work around the missing motion, producing a style that the regulars recognized as distinct even if they couldn't have explained why. He had learned, over months in this room, to read the temperature of the crowd through sound rather than sight. When the room was warm, socially, not literally, the conversations were loud and overlapping, and the piano competed with them and lost, which was fine because the losing was the point, the music was wallpaper. When the room was cooling towards something else, the conversations became directional instead of ambient, the sound gathered into channels rather than spreading, and the piano suddenly became audible in a way it hadn't been 20 minutes earlier. He didn't turn to look at what was happening behind him. He had learned not to. He simply began to play more quietly, reducing his volume in the way a man reduces his profile when something large moves in his direction. At 9:58, he was playing so quietly that the men closest to him had to lean toward each other to be heard. That was the signal for the people who knew how to read it. Not a shot, not a shout, a piano getting softer. Wilhelm Schaefer at the end of the bar heard it and put down his second beer with the same careful precision he'd used on his first. The gambler against the back wall shifted in his chair, the bartender's hand, resting 6 inches from the mounted shotgun, didn't move toward it, not yet, but it stopped moving away from it. Pierce's glass was still full. And somewhere outside, on the street that ran between the Drovers Cottage and the smaller establishments to the east, Marshal Chauncey Whitney was handling whatever had pulled him away 45 minutes ago, in total ignorance of what was assembling itself in his absence, moving toward a shape that would be irreversible by the time he walked back through the door. The bartender had been watching Morco for 11 of the 12 minutes he'd estimated he had. He had tried 3 of the redirections he kept in his professional arsenal, and all 3 had failed in ways that told him something important. Morco was not reachable tonight by the ordinary instruments. Whatever had fixed itself in the deputy's intentions had fixed there before he walked through the door, which meant this had started somewhere else, at some earlier hour, and the saloon was simply where it had arrived. The question now was not whether it could be stopped. The question was whether it could be shaped, whether the thing that was coming could be given a different form than the form it was currently taking, whether the 12 minutes had been enough to change the specific geometry of the room in ways that would matter when the moment finally arrived. 1 minute remained of those 12. The body gives out before the mind admits it. 4 months on the Chisholm Trail produced a specific kind of physical degradation that the drovers carried into Ellsworth without fully understanding how compromised they were. The research that would eventually document this phenomenon didn't exist yet in 1873. The science of stress physiology wouldn't be formalized for another 60 years, but the effects were present and observable to anyone who knew what they were looking at. Chronic sleep deprivation, sustained nutritional deficiency, weeks of exposure to temperature extremes without adequate shelter. The specific neurological impact of prolonged vigilance, the state of sustained alertness required when you're responsible for 2,000 animals in terrain that can kill them and you in dozens of ways simultaneously. A man in this condition makes worse decisions. That is not a judgment, it is biology. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that manages impulse control, consequence evaluation, and the capacity to pause before acting, degrades measurably under chronic stress and sleep deprivation. A drover arriving in Ellsworth after 4 months on the trail was operating with significantly impaired executive function, which meant his capacity for patience, de-escalation, and accurate threat assessment was reduced in ways he could not perceive or compensate for, because the instrument he would use to perceive it was the same instrument that was damaged. He felt fine. He felt, in fact, released. The drive was over, the tension of responsibility had lifted, the social constraints of the trail camp had dissolved. He felt freer than he had in months. He was also less capable of managing himself than he had been in months. This combination did the subjective sensation of freedom and the objective reality of impaired judgment, was the psychological engine running underneath every cattle season saloon night in every Kansas town throughout the 1870s. The men who ran these establishments understood it empirically, even without the vocabulary to describe it clinically. They had watched enough seasons to know that a drover 3 days off the trail was a different and more dangerous proposition than a drover 3 weeks off it, and they priced and managed accordingly. 3 days was exactly where most of the men in the Drovers Cottage on August 15th were sitting. The psychology of men in groups under these conditions followed patterns that the saloon's experienced observers had catalogued without writing down. Status assertion came first. The need, after months of clearly defined trail hierarchy, to re-establish personal position in a new social order. It expressed itself in small performances, how a man ordered his drink, how much he tipped or pointedly didn't tip, which table he chose and how he arranged himself at it. These were not random behaviors. They were negotiations conducted in the non-verbal grammar of men who spent their professional lives communicating across distances too large for words. Second came the release of deferred grievances. 4 months on the trail required a suspension of personal conflict that was enforced not by affection, but by necessity. A man who had a problem with the trail boss or with the drover who snored in the camp adjacent to his, or with the cook who consistently gave the larger portion to someone else, could not address it during the drive without risking the cohesion of a crew on whom his survival literally depended. So he didn't. He held it in the specific compressed way that men hold things they intend to address later, and later was now, and Ellsworth was where later happened. Some of the confrontations that ignited in Cattletown saloons had nothing to do with anyone in the room. They were the finally released pressure of arguments that had been stored since April, in Indian Territory, on the wrong side of the Cimarron River, between men who weren't even in Kansas anymore. The target in the saloon was simply the available object. The bartender, who had been doing this long enough, knew how to read that particular flavor of displaced anger. It had a quality of misdirection to it, a sense that the man coming at you was coming from somewhere else, aimed at something you couldn't see and couldn't address. Happy Jack Morco's anger had that quality. Whatever had crystallized between him and Cad Pearce contained elements that predated this room, this season, this particular Tuesday night in August. The documents that survive don't give the full archaeology of it. Frontier disputes rarely generated the paper trail that historians need. But the pattern is visible in the accounts of witnesses who were there. This was not a fresh conflict, it was an old one that had been waiting for a room like this, a marshal absent like this, a moment when the geometry of people and alcohol and exhaustion had arranged itself into the specific configuration that made action feel like resolution. That configuration was almost complete. Now consider the women, because they were in this room and they were not incidental to it. And the history that came after did them the specific disservice of making them decorative in a place where they were operational. There were 7 women working in the Drovers Cottage on the night of August 15th. 3 were dance hall girls, employees of the establishment, who were paid to dance with customers at 25 cents a dance, a portion of which they kept, and a portion of which went to the house. 2 were what the period's documents called soiled doves, a contemporary euphemism, who worked out of the rooms upstairs under an arrangement with the proprietor. 1 was the cook, a black woman in her 40s, whose name appears in no record connected to this night, but whose presence is documented in the payroll ledger that the Ellsworth Historical Archive holds. And 1, the one who matters most for the shape of what happened, was a woman named Lizzie. Lizzie's last name is disputed across the 3 sources that mention her. What is consistent across those sources is her function in the room. She was not a dance hall employee in the standard sense. She was, by the accounts of people who knew her, closer to what a modern person might call a house manager. The person who knew which customers needed watching, which needed extracting from a situation before it became a situation, and which needed to be steered toward the door with enough social grace that they didn't register it as being managed. She was 26 years old. She had been in Ellsworth for 2 years. The story of how women like Lizzie ended up in frontier saloons is not the story that the legend tells, and understanding the difference requires holding 2 facts simultaneously. First, in 1873, an unmarried woman in American society had almost no legal personhood. She could not vote, could not own property in most states, could not sign a contract, could not testify in many courts, could not access higher education at most institutions. Her economic options were domestic service, factory work, teaching if she was educated, or marriage. Second, a woman who worked in a frontier saloon, particularly one who had been there long enough to establish herself, operated in an economic and social reality that inverted nearly every one of those constraints. She could own property, many did, because she was unmarried, legally required to be, in the practical sense that marriage would have transferred all her assets and agency to a husband. She retained her legal personhood in ways that married women did not. She could sign leases, she could hold accounts, she could negotiate contracts with the saloon proprietor, and in some cases, over time, become the proprietor. The women who ran the major establishments in Dodge City, Wichita, and Abilene during the cattle era were not exceptions to the social pattern. They were the logical outcome of a legal structure that accidentally gave economic freedom to the one category of women it had intended to stigmatize. This is the inversion that the legend buried. Lizzie earned more in a busy week of cattle season than a Kansas schoolteacher earned in a month. She had a savings account at the land office, which served the bank function for Ellsworth residents since there was no formal bank yet, and in that account she had $430, a sum that placed her in the top tier of wealth among Ellsworth's permanent population. She was saving for something. The documents don't say what. She was also, on the night of August 15th, the person in the room who had been watching the Morco-Pierce situation longest. Longer even than the bartender, because she had been present since 4 in the afternoon and had seen Morco come in, register the room, and settle into his position with the slow deliberateness of a man installing himself rather than simply arriving. She had seen something like this before. Not exactly this. Something in the same family. The previous time, 2 years earlier, she had moved without thinking, had stepped into the physical space between two men in the seconds before the moment of contact, not because she was fearless, but because her body had made the calculation before her mind finished the sentence. It had worked. Barely. The shock of her presence in the geometry of the confrontation had introduced a hesitation, and hesitation had been enough. She was calculating whether to try it again. The difference this time was Morco's badge. A deputy sheriff was not a civilian, and the legal consequences of inserting herself into what a deputy might later characterize as the execution of his duties were not predictable. She understood frontier law well enough to know that its interpretation depended heavily on who was doing the interpreting and what story got told first. She was still calculating when Billy Thompson walked through the door. Thompson's arrival changed the specific configuration of the room in a way that was not immediately legible. He was Cad Pierce's man, from the same outfit, from the same drive, from the months-long intimacy of a trail crew that made men know each other's breathing patterns in sleep. His presence at Pierce's table was not aggressive. He sat down, registered nothing of what had been accumulating for the past 2 hours, and called for a drink with the loose expansiveness of a man who had started his evening somewhere else and brought the mood of it with him intact. Pierce looked at him. Something passed between them that everyone in the room who was watching, the bartender, the gambler against the wall, Lizzie, Wilhelm Schaefer with his hand flat on the bar, registered without being able to name. Not words. Not a gesture that could be described in a sentence. Something that belonged to the non-verbal language of men who had ridden together through weather and disaster, and the particular crucible of a cattle drive. Something that communicated a thing that no one outside that relationship could fully decode. After it passed, Pierce moved his hands back to the table. Not toward the glass, not away from it, just back to the table, flat, the way they had been positioned before Thompson arrived, but differently. Not the stillness of a man holding himself in check, the stillness of a man who had just received information that changed his calculation. Morco saw it too. and Morco, who had been waiting for a very specific configuration of this room, felt something shift in the version of tonight he had been constructing in his mind since he walked through the door. His hand, which had been drifting by centimeters toward his hip for the past 40 minutes, in a movement so slow it was barely movement at all, paused. The room had changed shape. Whether that change was enough, whether the presence of Billy Thompson, drunk and oblivious and sitting 3 feet from Cad Pearce, had altered tonight's architecture in a way that helped or made it worse, was a question that no one in the room could answer yet. The variables had multiplied, and multiplied variables in a space this compressed, with this many weapons and this much accumulated pressure, did not generally resolve toward calm. What they generally resolved toward was the thing that nobody had fully planned, the outcome that surprised everyone, including the people who caused it, the specific shape of violence that the frontier produced over and over again, and that the legends afterward converted into something cleaner and more intentional than it ever actually was. The bartender had used his last redirection 7 minutes ago. He had nothing left in the arsenal except the one tool he had been avoiding all night, the one he used only when every other option had been exhausted, because using it changed the room permanently and could not be undone. He was looking at it now, this last option, turning it over in his mind with the speed of a man who understands that the time for careful consideration has already passed. Outside, somewhere on the street that ran east toward the other establishments, Marshal Whitney was still occupied with whatever had pulled him away 45 minutes ago. He had not sent word, he had not returned, and the worst was not behind them. The worst was in the room, positioned near the door, wearing a badge, with his hand, finally, unmistakably, no longer drifting but moving. The last tool the bartender had was his own body, not as a weapon. As an obstacle, a physical presence inserted into the geometry of the room at the right moment, the human equivalent of a door placed in a hallway, something that required acknowledgement, and therefore introduced the one commodity that was running out: time. He had done this before. Twice in 4 seasons, he had stepped out from behind the bar and walked toward a situation that was compressing toward its endpoint, and both times the act of his movement through the room had been enough to introduce a hesitation that allowed something else to happen first. He was already moving when Morco took the 3 steps toward Pearce's table. The distance from behind the bar to Pearce's table was approximately 22 feet. The bartender covered 11 of them before the room understood what was happening, before the collective awareness that had been holding itself in suspended tension finally released and everything began moving at once. Tables pushed back by inches, chairs angled toward exits. The piano stopped completely, not with a formal ending, but with an unfinished phrase hanging in the air, cut off mid-note like a sentence whose speaker just realized he shouldn't finish it. That silence, when the piano stopped, was the loudest thing in the room. Morco had covered 2 of his 3 steps. Pearce had not moved. His hands were still flat on the table, a posture that read differently now, not as stillness, but as refusal. Billy Thompson, who had been in the middle of his first drink since arriving, looked up from his glass with the slow comprehension of a man catching up to a situation that had started long before he got there. What he saw in Pearce's face across the table was not fear. It was something harder than fear, something that had been there longer. The bartender reached 11 feet. What happened in the next 4 seconds has 3 versions in the historical record, none of them complete, all of them consistent on one point. A shot was fired from outside the room, not inside, outside, through the front window. the large glass pane that faced the street, the one that was one of the few real windows in the building, the one that let enough light in during the day that the lamps could stay unlit until 5. It did not shatter completely. One pane fractured from the lower left corner, and the report, the sound of the gun, arrived a half-second after the crack of the glass, which meant the shot had been fired at some distance from the street or from the far side of it. Everyone in the room dropped or flattened in the first second. Everyone except Morco, who spun toward the window with his weapon already drawn, and Pierce, who used the moment, the spinning, the noise, the collective flinch of every body in the room redirecting its attention toward the window, to move, not away from the table, toward the back wall. 3 fast steps, low, using the mass of other people and overturned chairs as cover, moving with the focused economy of a man whose instincts had been sharpened by years of doing dangerous work in open terrain. In the second second, nobody knew where anyone was, that darkness of orientation, the moment after sudden violence when the brain is still processing which threat is primary and where the body should direct itself, lasted longer in that room than it should have because the lamp nearest the window had been knocked from its hook by someone's elbow during the initial drop, and the oil had spilled across the floor and caught, and now there was fire, small but present, a 15-inch tongue of flame spreading along a line of spilled lamp oil toward the base of the bar. Fire in a wooden building in a town with no fire brigade. The bartender saw it before anyone else because he was the only person in the room, still on his feet and moving with intention. He reached the bar in 4 steps, pulled the water bucket kept below the counter for exactly this category of emergency, and covered the fire in a single motion that extinguished it completely, but soaked a 6-foot radius of floor and left the nearest 2 men, who had been flattened against the base of the bar, drenched in grey water that smelled of ash and old wood. 12 seconds had passed since the window broke. The room reassembled itself with the ragged efficiency of people who needed to understand what had just happened before they could decide what to do next. Men came up from behind tables, from behind the bar, from pressed flat positions against the walls. Someone near the door was checking himself for wounds with the methodical pressing of hands that men do when they aren't sure yet whether they've been hit and are afraid to look directly. He found nothing. He had not been hit. Nobody inside the room had been hit. The shot through the window, and this would become one of the 3 disputed facts about this night, had come from Billy Thompson's gun, not from inside the saloon. Thompson had been outside when he fired it, which contradicted the accounts of several witnesses who placed him inside at Pierce's table during the shooting, which suggests either that Thompson had moved from the table to the street in the time between his arrival and the shot without anyone registering his departure, or that the witnesses were wrong, or that a third possibility existed that none of the surviving accounts were willing to name. What is documented is what followed. Marshal Whitney came through the door 40 seconds after the shot, moving fast, having heard the report from the street during his return from the other disturbance. He took in the room, the broken window, the wet floor, the scattered furniture, Morco standing with his weapon drawn, pointed at a window rather than a person, Pierce at the back wall, Thompson unaccounted for, and made the assessment of a man whose job required fast situation reading. His assessment was wrong, not catastrophically wrong. Wrong in the specific way that a man arriving 40 seconds late to a situation is always wrong. He was reading the aftermath and constructing a narrative of the event from its physical residue, and the physical residue did not contain the 45 minutes of pressure that had preceded the shot, the 2 hours before that during which the room had been constructing itself toward this moment, the months before that during which Morco and Pierce had been building the specific tension that tonight had finally found an outlet for. Whitney saw a broken window and a deputy with a drawn weapon. What he missed was that the deputy had not used the weapon on the person he had been positioning himself toward all evening, and that this gap between intention and action was not resolved. It had merely been interrupted. The window, the fire, the reorientation of the room's attention had broken the sequence, but not the condition that had generated it. Morco still had his weapon out. Pierce was still in the room. The financial ruin of the 1873 season was still in every drover's pocket. The whiskey was still in every bloodstream. Everything that had produced this moment was still present. And then the door opened again, and Billy Thompson walked through it. He was carrying his gun in his right hand, not holstered, and the expression on his face was the specific blankness of extreme intoxication attempting to process a complex social situation. The look of a man who knew something important had just happened and was working very hard to locate himself within it. He had been outside. He had fired a shot that had gone through a window of the establishment he had just exited. He did not appear to fully understand that these two facts were connected. Whitney looked at Thompson. Thompson looked at Whitney. Morco looked at neither of them. Morco was looking at Pierce. There is a specific kind of violence that happens not in the heat of a moment, but in its cooling, the kind that waits for the room to decide it's over, for the marshal to arrive and impose the narrative of resolution, and then moves in the gap between the official story and the actual condition of the people inside it. The room had decided the crisis was past. The lamp was out. The marshal was present. The immediate danger had a name now, a drunk man with a gun who had fired through a window, and naming a danger has a powerful effect on a crowd's sense of safety, whether or not the naming is accurate. The room relaxed by degrees, by the loosening of shoulders and the righting of chairs and the gradual return of voices. Morco had not relaxed. His weapon was holstered now. He had put it away when Whitney came through the door, a professional reflex, the correct behavior of a deputy in the presence of his marshal. But Holstead was not disarmed, and the thing that had been building in him since he walked into this room had not been discharged by a shot through a window from someone else's gun. It had been interrupted. Interrupted things do not end. They accumulate interest while they wait. Pierce knew this. He was at the back wall, and his eyes hadn't moved from Morco since the room came back to itself, and what he was doing, very still, very quiet, in a posture that required no interpretation from anyone who had spent time in violent places, was calculating. Not whether something was going to happen, when, and what the geography of the room now looked like compared to what it had looked like before. The bartender was behind the bar. He had returned there after the fire, after the bucket of water, after the room had reassembled around Whitney's arrival. And he was standing in his position now with a stillness that was different from his earlier watchfulness. This was the stillness of a man who had done everything available to him and had arrived at the edge of what was manageable. He had used his body, he had extinguished the fire, he had watched Whitney misread the room, he had seen Morco holster the weapon without releasing whatever was behind it. His hand was on the bar, not near the shotgun, on the bar, because the shotgun, used now in this room full of people, With the marshal present and Thompson half inside the door, and 30 bystanders who had already been through enough, would not solve the problem. It would become the problem, a new catastrophe on top of the existing one. He needed something else. He needed the one tool he hadn't tried yet, the one that wasn't in any of his professional repertoire, the one that operated not on the mechanics of the room, but on the specific individual who was still positioned between the marshal's narrative of resolution and the reality that remained unresolved. He needed Morco to hear something that couldn't be ignored, not a threat. Threats from a bartender to a deputy were legally and practically useless in 1873. Not an appeal to professionalism or decency, because those instruments had been exhausted against the wall of whatever Morco had decided before he walked in. Something else. Something that a man with a badge and a grievance and 4 months of a cattle season's worth of accumulated volatility in the room around him would still, at the last available moment, find it impossible to step over. The bartender looked at Wilhelm Schaefer at the end of the bar. Schaefer met his eyes. The German farmer who had been sitting on his stool for 5 hours watching a Tuesday night in a Kansas saloon becomes something that 4 years of Tuesday nights hadn't prepared him for, understood what the look meant, not because the bartender had communicated it in any specific way, because Schaefer had been watching this room for 4 years, and he knew, with the comprehension that comes from accumulated observation rather than instruction, exactly what was needed and exactly what the bartender was about to ask him to do. Schaefer put both hands flat on the bar. He opened his mouth, and what came out of it, in the specific silence of a room that had just convinced itself that danger had passed, in the language that was not English, in a voice that had the quality of something that cannot be performed because it is too plainly real, landed in the room the way a stone lands in still water. It was the name. Just the name. Morco's name, spoken by a man who had no stake in any of this, no history with either party, no professional interest in the outcome, spoken by a farmer who came in on Tuesday evenings and drank 2 beers and had never, in 4 years, been heard to raise his voice about anything. Morco turned. The turn was the thing. The involuntary physics of it, because a name spoken in that register, by that kind of person, in that silence, triggers something below the decision-making layer, something older than judgment, something that makes the body respond before the mind has finished deciding whether to respond. He turned, and in turning he moved, and in moving he changed the geometry that had been so carefully assembling itself across the room, and the line between his eyes and Pierce's back wall was broken. 3 seconds, maybe 4. But Pierce had moved in them. Not toward the door, toward the corner, the darkest part of the back wall, where 2 large drovers who had been flattened during the confusion were now standing, situating Pierce in a pocket of bodies that made a clean line of action toward him geometrically impossible. Not safe. The frontier did not offer safe, but differently positioned in a configuration that had costs and complications that hadn't existed 30 seconds earlier. Whitney was still processing Thompson. Morco was still turned from the redirected name. The room was still inhabiting the story of its own resolution. And the night had shifted, not ended, not resolved, but shifted by fractions into a new arrangement whose outcome was not yet written. Outside, Kansas was dark and enormous and indifferent. The question that nobody in the room could answer, that the bartender standing motionless behind his bar couldn't answer, that Lizzie watching from the far wall couldn't answer, that Wilhelm Schaefer on his stool had bought seconds but not certainty for, was whether the shift was enough. Whether the geometry of bodies, the turned head, The broken line of sight had introduced enough interruption to change the shape of what was still, undeniably, unfinished. Morco's hand was at his side now, not on the weapon, not away from it. Whitney arrested Billy Thompson, not Morco. Thompson, the man who had fired through the window, the man standing in the doorway with his weapon in his hand, and his expression still assembling itself into something that resembled comprehension. Whitney took the gun, turned Thompson by the shoulder, and moved him toward the door with the practiced efficiency of a man who needed to establish visible control of a situation whose real architecture he hadn't yet mapped. It was the correct procedural response to the evidence in front of him. It was also the decision that left Morco unaddressed inside the room. Thompson went without resistance. He was too drunk to offer any. The door closed behind them. Marshal Whitney, the only official authority in the Drovers Cottage, had just walked out of it with the wrong man. The room understood this before Whitney reached the street, not collectively, not all at once, understanding, moved through the Drovers Cottage in a wave, table by table, face by face, as each person did the same rapid subtraction. Marshall gone, Thompson gone, Morco still here, Pierce still here, and whatever had been building between them for the past 2 hours, still here with them, unresolved, now stripped of the one structural element that had been providing the room with the illusion of official oversight. The conversations that had tentatively restarted dropped again. The chairs that had been angled back toward their tables angled back toward the walls. Morco turned around. Pierce was still in the back corner, positioned in the pocket of bodies that the geometry of the past few minutes had placed him in. But the pocket had thinned. 2 of the drovers who had been flanking him had moved during the Whitney-Thompson interaction, drawn toward the door by the gravity of official action and the human instinct to track authority when it moves. Pierce was not exposed, but he was more exposed than he had been 90 seconds earlier. This is the thing about the myth, the legend of the frontier gunfight, the one that American culture spent the following century constructing and refining and selling back to itself in 1,000 films and novels and television serials, is a story about 2 men who face each other in an empty street in full daylight and reach for their weapons at the same moment, the faster man surviving, the whole transaction clean and comprehensible and subject to the retrospective moral evaluation of a watching audience. It is a story about individual agency operating in open space with clear sightlines and a simple binary outcome. What was happening in the Drovers Cottage on the night of August 15, 1873, was nothing like that. There were no clear sightlines. There were no 2 men in isolation. There was a room full of people whose presence and position and individual decisions were all simultaneously variables in an outcome that nobody was controlling, in a darkness made denser by spilled lamp oil and the residual smoke of extinguished fire, with a marshal who had just removed himself from the equation by following the wrong thread of evidence. The historical record of frontier violence in Kansas during the cattle era tells the same story over and over. Fewer than 1 in 5 documented killings in the cow towns was a face-to-face confrontation between 2 armed men who had agreed, implicitly or explicitly, to the terms of the encounter. The rest were ambushes, accidents, misidentifications, and the specific category of violence that happens when a room full of people under extreme stress reaches the point where the pressure has to go somewhere. The Fast Draw was a performance invented after the fact for audiences who needed the frontier to be legible. The real thing was messier and stranger and in many ways more terrible because it had no clear protagonist, no clean moral structure, and no moment at which a watching person could point and say, "There, that is where it turned." It turned in 100 small places simultaneously, or it didn't turn at all, and the difference between the nights that ended in death and the nights that didn't was often not heroism or skill or the intervention of law. It was the specific configuration of ordinary people making ordinary decisions that happened in aggregate to add up to something that contained the damage. The bartender had been behind the bar for 4 years. He had watched seasons accumulate. He had watched the Ellsworth of 1870 become the Ellsworth of 1873, the early roughness hardening into something more specific and more dangerous as the money grew larger and the stakes attached to it became more clearly defined. He had watched men he knew casually become men he understood deeply, not through friendship, but through the specific intimacy of a bartender's knowledge. The debts, the letters, the things said at closing time when the room had emptied to the last 2 or 3, and the professional performance of sobriety had been abandoned. He knew things about Morco that Morco did not know he knew. The hidden ledger. The small notes in the back pages of the Bible, written in the hours between 3 and 6 in the morning when the saloon was empty. 4 years of records, not formal accounts, not legal documents, but the kind of information that accumulates when you are the person that everyone talks to, the person present at the moments when men stop managing their presentation and simply speak. Debts, agreements. The specific account of an incident from the previous summer involving Morco and a Mexican drover named Salazar, an incident that had not produced formal charges, that existed in no official record, but that 3 witnesses had described to the bartender in detail at different times across the following months. He had never used any of it. He had kept it the way a careful person keeps anything of uncertain future value, not as a weapon, not as leverage, but as information, which is a category of resource whose usefulness depends entirely on the moment and context of its application. In 4 years, he had not encountered a moment where the ledger's contents were the right instrument. He had reached for other tools first, the short pour, the redirected conversation, the strategic positioning of his own body, the borrowed voice of Wilhelm Schaefer. All of those instruments were now spent. He reached under the bar, not for the shotgun, for the ledger itself. A flat, cloth-covered book, 8 inches by 5, its cover dark with years of handling, indistinguishable from an account book to anyone who didn't know what was in it. He set it on the bar, not opened, not displayed, simply placed on the polished wood, in the lamplight, in a position that Morco could see from anywhere in the room. Morco saw it. The recognition was not immediate. It took 3 seconds, 4. The delayed processing of a man whose attention had been fixed elsewhere and was now being redirected by an object whose significance required a moment to assemble. Then the recognition arrived in his face the way cold water arrives, sudden, total, impossible to unexperience. He knew what that book was. He had seen it before, years earlier, without understanding what the bartender used it for. He had, in fact, told the bartender something in its presence, not directly, not intending to be recorded, but in the way that men talk when they are at the end of a long night and the room is almost empty, and the person behind the bar has become, through sheer accumulated presence, something closer to furniture than witness. He knew what was in it. The specific nature of the Salazar incident, and the names of the 3 men who had described it to the bartender, and the fact that at least one of those men was still in Ellsworth and could be located by a county prosecutor with modest effort, passed through Morco's mind in the form that information passes when it is newly, urgently relevant, not as words, as wait. Morco's hand was still at his side. The bartender had not touched the ledger since placing it on the bar. He was standing behind it with his hands visible, flat on the wood on either side of the book, in the posture of a man who is presenting something rather than threatening with it. A distinction so precise and so important that the difference between the two was the entire fulcrum on which the next 60 seconds balanced. A threat could be met with a threat. A presentation required a different kind of response. The room was very quiet. Pierce, in the back corner, had seen the ledger placed on the bar. He did not know what it contained, but he had been in enough saloons, worked with enough trail bosses, navigated enough frontier disputes to understand when a man with information had decided to let another man know he had it. The mechanics were universal enough that the specific content was almost irrelevant to the reading. He watched Morco's face. What moved across it in the following seconds was not simple. It was the specific expression of a man conducting a very fast internal audit, calculating exposure, calculating the credibility of the ledger's contents against the credibility of his own position, calculating what Whitney, currently occupied with Thompson outside, would make of whatever story the room would tell if the next 30 seconds went the way they had been building toward. The calculation was not going in the direction the evening had been heading. Because this is the thing that the legend also missed, the thing that the clean mythology of frontier justice erased from the record. The cattle towns survived their own violence not through superior gunfighters or heroic lawmen, but through the accumulated social capital of people who had been present long enough to know things. The bartender was not faster than Morco. He was not stronger, not armed in this moment with anything more than a book on a bar. What he had was 4 years of Tuesday nights and the specific, terrible knowledge that those nights had generated, and the willingness to place that knowledge on the table in plain view at the moment when nothing else would do. Morco looked at the ledger for 7 seconds. Then he looked at the bartender. A long look, flat and unreadable except for the one thing it couldn't fully conceal, which was the recognition that the ledger changed the arithmetic of the evening in ways that could not be undone simply by moving fast enough. He walked to the bar, not toward Pierce, toward the bar, a trajectory that required passing within 6 feet of where Pierce stood in the back corner, a proximity that caused every set of eyes in the room to track him with the fixed attention of people watching something that requires no interpretation, only witness. He reached the bar. He stood there. He did not reach for the ledger. He did not look at it again. He set both hands on the bar in a position that was neither aggressive nor defeated. The position of a man who has arrived at a destination without being certain why he chose it, whose body has made a decision while his mind was still reviewing the options. The bartender poured a drink, not for Pierce, for Morco, set it in front of him the way he set drinks in front of everyone who arrived at his bar, with the professional equanimity of a man for whom the act of pouring was the same regardless of who was receiving it, a small, consistent ritual that communicated without stating that the terms had changed, that what had been building was not being met with confrontation or with judgment, that the bar was a place where a man could arrive and receive a drink, and that receiving the drink was, in the grammar of this space, an acknowledgement that the alternative had been considered and set aside. Morco looked at the glass. He picked it up. He drank. The room breathed, not all at once, not with any dramatic exhalation, but in the distributed, incremental way of a space that has been holding tension in 50 different bodies and is releasing it 50 different ways. A chair scraped back into its normal position. A card was laid on a table. Somewhere near the door, a man's laugh started up again. Quiet, short, the laugh of someone who needed the sound of normalcy and was producing it deliberately. The piano player, who had been sitting at his instrument with his hands in his lap since the moment the window broke, played a note, then another. Not a song, just notes, finding their way back into the room, the way light finds its way into a space after a door has been opened, tentatively, one point at a time. Pierce stayed in the back corner for another 20 minutes. He did not approach the bar. He did not speak to anyone who spoke to him, except to respond with the minimal acknowledgement that social survival required. At some point after 11 o'clock, he moved toward the side door, not the main entrance, the smaller door at the back of the room near the kitchen, the one the staff used, and went through it, and was not seen in the Drovers Cottage again that season. Outside, Whitney had Thompson in custody and was beginning the process of understanding that his evening's work was not finished. The paperwork for discharging a firearm within city limits was simple. The larger question, what had actually been happening inside the Drovers Cottage during the 45 minutes of his absence, and what had resolved it, and how, would take considerably longer to understand, and in some ways he would never fully understand it at all, because the most important thing that had happened was between two men and a book on a bar, and had left no mark that official documentation could capture. The ledger went back under the bar. The bartender put it in its place, below the shelf, next to the medical text and the two worn novels. And then he picked up his cloth and began wiping the bar, working the wood in slow circles, moving down its length, the way he moved down it every night at closing, a mechanical motion that required nothing from the mind and gave the hands something to do while the rest of the system processed what the last 3 hours had contained. He had one question that the evening hadn't answered. Not about Morco. Morco's night was over in the ways that mattered. Not about Pierce. Pierce was gone. The question was about the ledger itself, and whether placing it on the bar had done what he intended, or simply delayed, something that would reassemble itself tomorrow night, next week, at another establishment in another cattle town, where the same combination of men and money and exhaustion and weapons would find each other in the dark. He didn't know, he couldn't know. What he knew was that tonight, in this room, in this specific hour, the configuration had held. The thing that had been building since April, since before April, since the specific morning that Morco and Pierce had first established their mutual understanding of the other's position in the world, had found a different outlet. Not resolution, a different direction. And in a space as compressed and volatile as a Kansas cattle town saloon in the summer of 1873, a different direction was the closest available approximation of safety. The piano was playing something recognizable now, slow, a little ragged, but continuous. 40 minutes later, Whitney came back through the door. He looked at the room, the righted chairs, the resumed card games, Morco at the bar with a glass in front of him, the piano working its way through something that might have been a waltz, and reached the conclusion that any reasonable man would reach from that evidence. He concluded that whatever had been happening when he left had resolved itself in his absence, the way things sometimes did, the way the frontier's social pressures sometimes found their own equilibrium without requiring official intervention. He was not entirely wrong, but he had missed the thing that made the equilibrium possible, the specific instrument and the specific hand that had applied it, and so the conclusion he reached contained a gap, a blind spot in his understanding of how Ellsworth managed itself, a gap that would have consequences he couldn't foresee, because he didn't know it was there. By dawn, two things were certain. Billy Thompson would face charges for discharging a firearm within city limits and whatever else Whitney's paperwork produced. And Ellsworth's cattle season of 1873, already bent by financial collapse, already straining under the pressure of 15,000 men moving through a town built for 1,000, had passed through the night that many people in the room had believed, at some point between 10 o'clock and midnight, would be its worst. Whether they were right about that was a question the following week would answer. The following week answered the question badly. On August 23rd, 8 days after the Tuesday night at the Drovers Cottage, Happy Jack Morco shot and killed a drover named Jeremiah Brown in a dispute that began at a different establishment and ended in the street outside it. The circumstances were contested. Morco claimed self-defense, and 2 witnesses supported him, and 2 others described a sequence of events that began with Morco rather than ending with him. The county prosecutor reviewed the available testimony and declined to pursue charges. Morco retained his badge. Chauncey Whitney was dead within the week, not killed by Morco. Killed by Billy Thompson, the man Whitney had arrested on the night of August 15th, the man who had fired through the window of the Drovers Cottage, the man who had been released on a fine that he paid with money borrowed from his brother. On August 22nd, the night before Morco shot Jeremiah Brown, Billy Thompson fired again, this time in a street confrontation that grew out of an argument whose origins the surviving accounts describe differently depending on who wrote them. The bullet struck Whitney in the chest. He died within hours in a room above the hardware store, tended by the doctor who had been out on a house call the night of August 15th and had returned to find his town measurably different from the one he'd left. Ellsworth's marshal was dead. His deputy remained. The town council met in emergency session on August 24th and made a series of decisions with the compressed urgency of a body that had run out of time for deliberation. Morco was dismissed, his badge removed, his employment terminated, his presence in Ellsworth made sufficiently unwelcome that he departed within days. The council appointed a temporary marshal and immediately sent inquiries to several men with reputations for managing exactly this category of problem in exactly this category of place. One of the men they contacted was a 25-year-old from Lamar, Missouri, who had been working in various law enforcement capacities across Kansas for 2 years, and whose name was already circulating in the specific professional network of men who did this work. He did not take the Ellsworth position. He was occupied elsewhere in a different Kansas cattle town, building the reputation that would eventually make his name a permanent feature of the American imagination. His name was Wyatt Earp. The Ellsworth connection to Earp is documented but minor. A contact, a letter, a conversation about terms that didn't produce an agreement. He never served in Ellsworth, but his trajectory across Kansas in the years immediately following 1873 traced the same arc that every major cattle town traced in this period, and understanding that arc explains what happened to Ellsworth, to the saloons, to the entire world that had been built around the convergence of cattle money and railroad access, and the specific human ecosystem that sustained it. That world was already ending. The panic of 1873 contracted the cattle market for 2 full years. Ranchers who had planned drives curtailed them. The volume of cattle moving up the Chisholm Trail dropped sharply in 1874, and the economic ecosystem of Ellsworth, which had been built entirely around a single industry's surplus, contracted with it at a speed that left almost no time for adjustment. The merchants who had built stores on the assumption of continued cattle traffic found themselves holding inventory for a market that wasn't arriving. The saloon owners, who had expanded their operations for a volume of customers that didn't materialize in 1874, found themselves with establishments sized for a boom that had already moved on. The railroad moved south. This was the structural shift that no amount of local adaptation could address. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway pushed its line further into Kansas in 1872 and 1873, reaching Wichita and then, progressively, further south and west, closer to the Texas ranches, reducing the length of the drive required, making the northern terminus of the Chisholm Trail obsolete. By 1875, the cattle that had been flooding Ellsworth were flooding Wichita instead. By 1876, they were heading for Dodge City. Ellsworth's cattle season, which had peaked at over 100,000 head in 1872, declined toward zero across the following 3 years. The Drovers Cottage closed its doors in 1875, not dramatically, not with the kind of symbolic ending that a story wants to provide. It simply stopped operating. The proprietor moved to Wichita, where the money had gone. The building stood empty for a winter and then was purchased by a grain merchant who converted it into a storage facility. The bar was removed. The mirror, that largest piece of glass for 50 miles, it was carefully taken down and shipped east, back toward a civilization that had produced it and to which it was now returning. The piano player had already left by then. So had Lizzie. Her departure from Ellsworth is documented in the Land Office records. A withdrawal of funds from her account, $462, recorded in September 1873, the month after the night, at the Drovers Cottage. Where she went, the records don't say. Wichita is probable. Dodge City is possible. Women with her specific combination of skills and capital and the particular knowledge of frontier social mechanics that 4 years in Ellsworth had generated were not limited in their options by 1873. The frontier kept moving west, and the economy of the frontier kept needing the infrastructure that she understood how to build. She had saved enough. That much the ledger confirms. The bartender stayed in Ellsworth longer than almost anyone else from that world. He is documented in the town's census records through 1877, listed first as a saloon keeper and then, in the later years, as a merchant, a transition that reflects the town's own transformation from cattle hub to agricultural settlement, the adaptation of a man who had built his professional life around reading what a room needed and providing it. The specific ledger, the cloth-covered book with its 4 years of recorded information, does not appear in any inventory or estate record. It may have been destroyed, it may have been kept. What it contained, nobody outside one Tuesday night in August 1873 ever fully knew. Wilhelm Schaefer's farm survived the difficult years. His wheat did poorly in 1873 and 1874, but the German farming communities that had settled east of Ellsworth had built the kind of mutual aid infrastructure that the drovers passing through the saloon had never possessed. A network of neighbors who shared equipment, shared labor at harvest, shared credit to the local merchant when a season failed. He planted rye in 1875 as a hedge against wheat's vulnerability to dry springs. It worked. His farm was still operating under his family's name when the county produced its first formal census in 1880. He stopped coming to the Drovers Cottage before it closed, not because it had changed, because he had watched it change in the gradual way that a person who visits somewhere consistently perceives changes that occasional visitors miss. He had watched it become less than it was in 1873, the peak of it, the specific compressed intensity of a world running at its maximum possible volume. He came less often and then not at all, and the Tuesday evenings he had spent on a stool at the end of a bar, watching the world of the frontier become itself were replaced by other Tuesday evenings, quieter, less eventful, in a town that was slowly becoming a different kind of place. Morco's fate is the one that the legend would prefer to be more dramatic. After his dismissal from Ellsworth, he appears in records in 2 other Kansas towns over the following 3 years, not as a lawman, but as a presence in the same ecosystem he had occupied in Ellsworth, a man whose reputation preceded him in the specific professional network of frontier violence and its management. He died in 1879 in Caldwell, Kansas, under circumstances that the newspaper account of the time described as a dispute over a card game. He was 41 years old. The account mentions no survivors. The violence that had been building in the Drovers Cottage on August 15th, the thing that had been shaped and redirected by a ledger on a bar and a German farmer's voice in a silent room, had found him eventually. It found most of them eventually. The frontier was not a place that allowed indefinite deferral. Billy Thompson lived until 1897. This fact requires a moment because it seems wrong. The man whose bullet killed Marshall Whitney, the man whose entrance through the door of the Drovers Cottage had been the first disruption of the evening's terrible geometry, died at 56 in relative obscurity after decades of drifting through the remaining cattle towns and gambling circuits of the diminishing West. He was never convicted of Whitney's killing. The legal proceedings that followed Whitney's death produced a verdict that reflected the evidentiary standards of 1873 Kansas rather than any determination of factual truth. And the evidentiary standards of 1873 Kansas were, in practice, the standards of a place where witnesses had reasons to remember things in particular ways. Cad Pierce rode out of Ellsworth before the end of the cattle season. His trail after August 1873 is thin in the records, a name appearing in 2 different Texas county documents over the following decade, once in a land dispute and once in a cattle transaction, suggesting a man who had returned to his trade and continued it in the more ordinary way that most men who passed through the Kansas cattle towns continued their ordinary lives. The extraordinary compression of that Tuesday night, the 2 hours of a full glass on a table, the weight of the entire season's accumulated pressure balanced on the specific geometry of one room, was for him one night among several thousand. It was not necessarily the night that defined him. For the town, it was different. Ellsworth's experience of the 1873 season, the financial collapse, Whitney's killing, the emergency dismissal of its deputy marshal, the accelerating departure of the cattle trade, produced a specific institutional response that reshaped its character permanently. The town that remained after the cattle economy left was a farming community, and farming communities have different civic needs than cattle depots. The improvised, flexible, multi-purpose social institutions of the boom years, the saloon as courthouse, bank, post office, information hub, were gradually replaced by actual courthouses, actual banks, and actual post office with a permanent address. Kansas passed its constitutional prohibition of alcohol in 1881. 8 years after the night at the Drovers Cottage, 8 years after the peak of everything that the frontier saloon had been and done and provided and failed to provide. The prohibition came not primarily from religious objection, though religious objection was the language it used. It came from the merchants and farmers and permanent residents of Kansas towns who had spent a decade watching their communities absorb the damage generated by the intersection of alcohol and the specific human conditions of the cattle trade, and who had concluded that the institution was no longer providing something they needed badly enough to sustain the costs. They were not wrong from their perspective, but they were also closing a door on something that had been more than what they named when they described it. The saloon they were prohibiting was the vice establishment they had decided they could live without. The institution they were actually eliminating was the improvised civic space, the informal courthouse, the frontier information exchange, the place where a bartender with a hidden ledger had made a decision at the right moment that changed the shape of a single Tuesday night, and possibly the shape of several lives. That institution had no other name, so when the saloon closed, it closed with it. The panic of 1873 eventually resolved. Financial panics do, though the resolution of this one took 5 years and reshaped the American economy in ways that are still traceable in the structure of banking regulation. The cattle trade recovered, peaked again in the late 1870s in Dodge City, and then declined permanently as barbed wire fencing began to close the open range in the early 1880s, ending the era of the great trail drives as completely as if a physical door had been shut. The railroads had pushed all the way to Texas by 1885, making the long drives economically pointless. The world that had built the Drovers Cottage, that had filled it with 80 bodies on a Tuesday night in August, that had generated the specific pressure that required the specific instrument of a hidden ledger placed on a polished bar. That world lasted approximately 15 years, from the first Abilene cattle season in 1867 to the closing of the last Dodge City drive in the early 1880s. 15 years. In the American memory, it lasted forever. The men who had been inside the saloons, who had dealt the cards and poured the drinks and watched the rooms and learned to read a crowd the way a navigator reads water, went somewhere. They became merchants, farmers, lawyers, politicians. A significant number of them became exactly the kind of respectable citizens whose later lives seemed to have no connection to what they had survived in the compressed intensity of the cattle years. The reformation of frontiersmen was so consistent a social pattern that it became a recognized type. The man with a quiet present and an unspecified past, who sat in church on Sunday mornings and managed his business affairs with a competence whose origin he declined to explain. They carried the Tuesday nights with them. Somewhere inside, unremarked, unreachable by any census or civic record. And the buildings they had inhabited, the wooden frame structures with their false fronts and their enormous mirrors and their pianos and their hidden ledgers, most of them burned. Not all, but most, in the fires that swept wooden frontier towns with the regularity that wood and lamplight and Kansas wind produced. Ellsworth burned twice. Abilene's main street burned in 1880. Dodge City burned in sections across a decade. The saloons went with them, and the world they had housed went with the saloons. What remained was the question that the ashes couldn't answer. What exactly had those places been, and whether anything that came after them understood how much they had been doing that nobody had ever officially acknowledged, and whether the civic life of the towns that replaced them was actually stronger or simply more legible, more organized into recognizable institutions, more easily described in the language of formal society, but perhaps less capable of the specific, improvised, person-to-person management of human crisis that a bartender with a hidden ledger had performed, in the dark, without recognition, for 4 years of Tuesday nights. That question didn't have an obvious answer in 1881. It still doesn't. The glass is still there. Not literally. The Drovers Cottage burned in 1876, and whatever remained of the physical objects inside it became ash and then Kansas dirt, indistinguishable from the ground it sat on. But the glass is still there in the way that certain images persist after the thing that generated them has been gone for 150 years, still legible, still carrying its original meaning for anyone who has followed the story far enough to understand what it was saying. A full glass, untouched, the last moment before a decision. Consider what has been lost in the distance between that room and this one, not the violence. The violence was preserved with great care, refined into legend, sold in every available format across the following century and a half, until the gunfight and the outlaw and the fast draw became among the most durable exports American culture has ever produced. What was lost was everything else: the bartender, the ledger, the piano getting quieter, the German farmer's voice in a silent room, the woman with $462 in a land office account, saving for something the records don't name. The specific, invisible, uncompensated labor of managing human crisis with no tools except knowledge and presence and the willingness to place what you knew on the table at the right moment. That labor was performed every night, in every cattle town, for 15 years. It was never recorded as heroism because it didn't look like heroism. It looked like a man wiping a bar. It looked like a short pour. It looked like a book placed on a polished counter in the lamplight of a room that was holding its breath. The actions that kept the Drovers Cottage from becoming a massacre on a Tuesday night in August were actions that left no mark on any official record. They exist only in the thin stratum of witness accounts and ledger entries and the negative space of what didn't happen, the violence that didn't occur, the bodies that weren't carried out. History records what breaks, it rarely records what held. Now consider the inheritance. The frontier saloon closed, was prohibited, burned, or simply emptied, as the cattle economy that sustained it migrated south and then disappeared. But the people who had built it and worked inside it and learned, through years of compressed necessity, how to manage a public space full of human volatility, those people went somewhere. They carried their specific knowledge into the towns that came after the cattle towns, into the civic life that grew up in the space the frontier had occupied. The open floor plan of the American bar is a direct inheritance, not a metaphor, an actual physical design lineage. The frontier saloon's insistence on unobstructed sight lines, the bar along one wall, the tables in the open center, nothing between the bartender's mirror and the farthest corner of the room, was a survival adaptation that became an aesthetic preference, that became a standard. Walk into any bar built in the 20th century, any diner, any roadhouse, and the spatial logic is the same spatial logic that the Drovers Cottage embodied in 1873. The reason it feels natural is because it was engineered over years of violent necessity to be the most functional possible arrangement of people in a semi-public space. The round, the custom of buying drinks for strangers, has the same origin. On the frontier, buying a round was not generosity in the social sense, it was a de-escalation technology. A man who bought a drink for the table that included his potential adversary had introduced an obligation into the room, a small social debt that required acknowledgement, and created, in its brief span, a human connection that made the next 60 seconds slightly less likely to end in violence. The bartender encouraged it. The custom spread. It outlasted the conditions that produced it by so many generations that the connection became invisible, and now it simply feels like what people do in bars, a social warmth whose origin was pure survival calculus. This is how the frontier lives in the present, not in the myths, in the furniture. The American tradition of campaign politics conducted in bars and diners, the candidate who shakes hands over a counter, who sits at a table with ordinary people, in an informal public space rather than in a formal hall is a direct behavioral inheritance from the frontier saloon's role as civic center. The Cattle Town Saloon was where political decisions were made, where candidates were evaluated, where disputes about land and water and grazing rights that would eventually become formal law were first argued out in the informal grammar of men who needed to reach workable agreements before sunup. The bar, as the site of democratic deliberation, is not a coincidence of modern campaign strategy. It is the persistence of a function that was established in the 1860s and 1870s in wooden buildings on the Kansas prairie. The politicians who stand at those counters are standing on the Drovers Cottage floor. Then there is the question of what the saloon's absence cost. Kansas's 1881 constitutional prohibition closed every legal saloon in the state and replaced the informal civic infrastructure they had provided with nothing. On the assumption that formal institutions would fill the gap, that the courthouse and the bank and the post office and the church would collectively provide what the saloon had collectively provided. In some respects they did, in others they didn't, and the gap they left was precisely the gap that the saloon had occupied most distinctively, the informal, low-barrier, non-judgmental public space where a man with $9 and a trail-worn coat and a letter he couldn't read could walk through a door and find himself in the same room on equal terms with men of property and standing and legal knowledge. That space, genuinely egalitarian in practice, if not in principle, accessible to anyone who could pay for a drink, was not replaced by the courthouse. The courthouse required appointments, paperwork, the specific social confidence of a person who understood formal institutional process. The saloon required nothing except a coin on the bar. This is not an argument for saloons. It is an observation about what informal civic spaces do that formal institutions cannot, and about what happens to communities when the informal spaces disappear without being replaced by anything that preserves their essential function. American cities spent most of the 20th century closing or pricing out the low-barrier public spaces, the neighborhood tavern, the corner diner, the park bench, that didn't require a permit, and the civic disconnection that followed was not coincidental. The researchers who study social isolation in modern American life describe a specific deficit, the absence of what the sociologist Ray Oldenburg called the third place, the space that is neither home nor work, where people encounter each other without agenda, where community is built through the accumulation of ordinary shared presence rather than through organized activity. Oldenburg published his analysis in 1989. He was describing something that the Drovers Cottage had been providing in 1873 without anyone having a name for it. The bartender knew what it was. He just called it Tuesday night. There is one more thing to say about the glass. The untouched drink, the full glass that Cad Pierce ordered, and did not touch for 2 hours while the room organized itself around the question of what it meant, was not, it turns out, what it appeared to be. This is the thing that the accounts of that night read carefully, suggest without stating directly. A man who intends violence does not advertise it with a glass of whiskey he refuses to drink. A man who orders a drink and doesn't touch it in a room full of people who understand the grammar of that space is sending a message in the language of the saloon, a language where objects and gestures and positions carry specific meaning that everyone in the room can read. The full glass was not defiance, it was communication. In the saloon's social grammar, a man who ordered a drink and left it untouched was saying, "I am here, I am present, I have not yet decided, I am giving this room and the people in it the opportunity to change the shape of what comes next." It was the frontier equivalent of a raised hand, not a threat, not a surrender, but a pause held open by a glass of whiskey that nobody drank. Pierce had been offering the room a chance all evening. Whether he knew this consciously or whether it was instinct shaped by years in spaces where you learned the grammar or you died of not knowing it, that question is beyond the reach of any surviving document. What the documents suggest is that the bartender understood it, that somewhere in the 2 hours of watching the untouched glass, he had read what Pierce was doing and had been working with every instrument available to him to make the room worthy of the offer. The ledger on the bar was his answer. This is what I know. This is what holding this room has cost me to learn. This is what I am placing between you and the thing that is building toward you. It was enough that night. The bartender, at 4 a.m, the saloon empty, the lamp turned down to its lowest point, wiping the bar in slow circles. Not because it needed wiping, because the motion was available and the mind needed something for the hands to do while the rest of it processed what the night had been. Outside, Kansas. The grass running to the horizon in every direction, invisible in the dark but present, enormous, indifferent to everything that had happened inside the wooden building sitting in the middle of it. The glass had been taken away, washed, put back on the shelf behind the bar, indistinguishable from the other glasses, ready for the next person who would order a drink and either touch it or not touch it, and either way tell the room something about themselves that the room would file away for later. Tomorrow night, the saloon would open at 4 o'clock. The drovers would come in from the cattle pens, the gamblers would take their tables, the piano would find its way back into a waltz, and the whole apparatus of human need and human danger would reassemble itself in this space the way it assembled itself every night of every season, without instruction, without design, driven by the same forces that had been driving it since the first season, and would continue driving it until the railroad moved south and the cattle stopped coming, and the building stood empty for a winter before the grain merchant arrived with his conversion plans. The bartender didn't know any of that yet. He knew this, that the glass was clean and back on the shelf, that the floor was dry, that the window was broken and would need to be replaced in the morning, and that the glass for it would have to come from Salina by rail and would cost more than it should. That somewhere east of town, Wilhelm Schaefer was asleep in a farmhouse on 320 acres of winter wheat that had done badly this year and might do better next year. That Lizzie had counted her money twice before she put it back in its place. He turned down the lamp. The room went dark. Not completely, the way indoor spaces never go completely dark when there is a street outside and a moon above it, but dark enough that the bar and the tables and the chairs and the shelf of bottles behind him were shapes rather than objects, present but undefined, the room existing in the transitional state between one night and the next. He stood there for a moment in that dark. Then he went to bed. Tomorrow was Wednesday. Wednesday. The cattle pens opened again at 7, and the buyers came in from the east on the morning train, and the whole apparatus started over, with the same forces, the same pressures, the same room, but configured differently because the people were different every day, and different configurations produced different outcomes. And the one thing the bartender's 4 years in this room had taught him beyond anything else was that the outcome was never determined in advance. It was determined in the room by the people in it. One decision at a time. The glass on the shelf caught a fragment of moonlight through the broken window, full, waiting, saying nothing yet.